August 15th, 1944. Untold Beach, Normandy, France. Oberst Heinrich Müller crouched in the bombed-out remains of a German coastal observation post 3 miles inland from what the Americans called Untold Beach. Through his binoculars, he watched something that made no tactical sense. The beach was chaotic incarnate. Landing craft disgorging supplies, trucks moving in endless streams, mountains of crates, barrels, vehicles, and ammunition grew larger by the hour. The Americans were building a logistics operation that dwarfed anything Müller had seen in 5 years of war. But that wasn't what confused him. What confused him was the speed. Müller had read captured American logistics manuals. He knew their planned unloading rates, 12,000 tons per day across all Normandy beaches combined. Ambitious but achievable with proper planning and adequate personnel. The beach in front of him was moving 14,000 tons per day by itself, just this one beach, with half the equipment the manuals said was necessary. Herr Oberst, his intelligence officer said, lowering his own binoculars, the American stevedore units operating that beach, they are Negroes, Müller finished. I can see that. Nearly every man on that beach was black. Loading, unloading, driving, organizing, working with a precision and speed that seemed mechanically impossible for human beings. Müller had spent 3 years analyzing American logistics. He knew their racial policies. He'd read their own documents insisting that black soldiers were inferior, suitable only for manual labor, incapable of complex operations. Yet here they were, moving cargo at rates that exceeded every projection, every standard, every assumption. How many men are down there? Müller asked. Intelligence estimates 2,400 in that single port battalion, Herr Oberst. 2,400 men doing the work of 5,000, Müller lowered his binoculars. Get me everything we have on these units. Organizational structure, command hierarchy, training methods. I want to understand how they're achieving this. Over the next 3 months, as German forces retreated across France, Müller would compile a comprehensive intelligence report on American port battalions. The report would be captured by Allied forces in December 1944 and filed away in classified archives for 50 years. When historians finally read it, they would discover something remarkable. German intelligence had understood what the American command tried very hard to ignore. The Black Port Battalions weren't just moving cargo. They were performing logistical miracles that made the entire Allied advance possible. They were operating at efficiency levels that white units couldn't match. They were, in the words of Müller's final report, the most effective logistics operation the Reich has encountered in any theater. German intelligence called them die Wundertäter, the miracle workers. The American command called them laborers, stevedores, manual workers performing unskilled tasks that anyone could do. This is the story of how 40,000 black soldiers moved 40% of all supplies that sustained the Allied victory in Europe. This is the story of men whose contribution was so critical that German intelligence analyzed them obsessively, while American history tried to erase them completely. This is the story of the miracle workers. To understand what the port battalions accomplished, you have to understand what the army believed about the men who comprised them. In 1942, United States Army doctrine was explicit. Black soldiers were suitable for labor roles, nothing more. This wasn't informal prejudice. This was codified policy backed by scientific studies. A 1925 Army War College analysis, still being cited in 1942, concluded that the Negro lacks initiative, mental flexibility, and capacity for independent judgment. He is suitable for supervised manual labor, but incapable of complex operations.
The reasoning was biological determinism dressed up as military science. Black Americans, the Army insisted, had smaller cranial capacities, limited intelligence, reduced problem-solving ability. They could lift, carry, and dig, but they couldn't think, organize, or lead. These were lies, but they were official lies, enforced through military regulations and justified through institutional authority. When America entered World War II, the Army faced an immediate problem. The war required massive logistics operations, and they didn't have enough white soldiers to handle it. Someone had to unload ships, organize supplies, and operate ports. The solution was elegant and cynical. Assign black soldiers to logistics roles. Call it essential war work to avoid accusations of discrimination. But structure the entire system to ensure black soldiers never demonstrated competence at anything except manual labor. Private Robert Madison enlisted in 1942, graduated high school with honors, scored in the 90th percentile on Army aptitude tests. The Army assigned him to the 320th Port Battalion as a stevedore, a cargo handler. Madison's daughter would later recall his stories. She told them he could read blueprints, that he'd worked construction, that he understood structural engineering. They handed him a cargo hook and told him to lift boxes. When he tried to suggest more efficient loading patterns, his white sergeant told him to shut up and follow orders. The Army didn't want black men thinking. They wanted black men working. The port battalions were organized under a structure designed to prevent black soldiers from exercising initiative or demonstrating leadership. White officers commanded every unit, usually men with no logistics experience, who'd been assigned to black units because it was considered the least desirable duty in the Army. White NCOs supervised every work detail. Black soldiers could reach technical grades like T5 or T4, but these weren't leadership positions. They were skill ratings that came with slightly higher pay, but no command authority. The entire system was built on the assumption that black soldiers needed constant white supervision, or they'd fail. Captain James Morrison, a white logistics officer assigned to command the 320th Port Battalion in 1943, later described his attitude when he received the posting. "I was angry. I'd trained for combat command, and they'd given me a labor battalion full of Negroes. I believed everything the Army told us, that these men were lazy, that they needed constant watching, that they couldn't handle complex tasks. I spent my first month trying to get reassigned. I spent my second month trying to run the unit the way the manual said. White officers make all decisions. White NCOs supervise every detail. Never trust the colored men to work unsupervised. By my third month, I realized something that would change my entire perspective. The manual was wrong. Everything I'd been taught was wrong." What Morrison discovered what would eventually become undeniable to anyone who actually worked with port battalions was that black soldiers were capable of extraordinary logistics performance, not despite the Army's restrictions, but in spite of them. The 320th Port Battalion arrived in England in February 1944, part of the massive build-up for the invasion of France. Their mission? Operate supply depots, prepare equipment for the invasion, learn the procedures they'd need when operating captured French ports. The Army's logistics manuals estimated a port battalion of 500 men could unload 2,500 tons of cargo per day under optimal conditions. The 320th, on their third day of operations at Southampton, unloaded 4,200 tons. Their white officers assumed it was a fluke. It wasn't. Day after day, the 320th Port Battalion exceeded every standard, every projection, every estimate. They developed their own procedures, their own organization methods, their own systems for tracking cargo and coordinating ship unloading. Captain Morrison watched his men work and realized something profound. They weren't just following orders. They were thinking, organizing, problem-solving, doing exactly what Army doctrine said black men couldn't do. I watched Corporal Jefferson, a sharecropper's son from Georgia with a third-grade education according to his file, mentally calculate load distributions that kept ships stable during unloading. Complex mathematics, structural engineering. He did it in his head while white college graduates with engineering degrees stood there with calculators. I watched Sergeant Williams coordinate 6 different ship unloadings simultaneously, managing truck schedules, crane operations, and cargo routing with a precision that required tracking hundreds of variables. He was doing the work of 3 logistics officers. And I realized the Army had taken the most capable men and convinced them and everyone else that they were only good for ditch digging. By May 1944, the 320th Port Battalion had the highest efficiency ratings of any logistics unit in their sector. They were unloading cargo 60% faster than comparable white units. They were experiencing fewer accidents, less damaged cargo, better inventory accuracy. The response from higher command was not recognition. It was suspicion.
How were black soldiers, who everyone knew were inferior, outperforming white units? There had to be an explanation. Maybe they were falsifying reports. Maybe the white officers were doing all the real work. Maybe the cargo they were handling was easier somehow. Every possible explanation except the obvious one, that black soldiers were just as capable as white soldiers when given the opportunity. Then came D-Day, and the performance that couldn't be denied. June 6, 1944, D-Day. The invasion of Normandy was the largest amphibious operation in history. 156,000 Allied troops landing across 5 beaches. The planning had been meticulous. Every detail was calculated, including the logistics. The invasion plan called for specific unloading rates to keep forces supplied. 12,000 tons per day across all beaches by D+3, 3 days after the initial landing. 18,000 tons per day by D+10. 25,000 tons per day by D+20. These weren't aspirational goals. These were minimum requirements. If the logistics failed, the invasion failed. Soldiers without ammunition couldn't fight.
Tanks without fuel couldn't advance. The entire operation depended on maintaining a constant flow of supplies from ships to front lines. The port battalions that would maintain this flow were predominantly black units, not because the Army trusted them with critical missions, because white soldiers were needed for combat roles and someone had to unload the ships. The 320th Port Battalion landed on Utah Beach on D+2, June 8, 1944. They waded ashore expecting organized facilities, established procedures, coordinated systems. What they found was chaos. The beach was a nightmare of abandoned equipment, destroyed vehicles, shelly craters, and bodies. The landing craft arrived with supplies but couldn't unload because previous ships' cargo was still scattered across the sand. Trucks couldn't move because roads were blocked. Supplies were piling up in random heaps because nobody knew where anything was supposed to go. The careful logistics plans had collapsed on contact with reality. Captain Morrison gathered his officers and senior NCOs. The plan was for white port companies to establish beachhead operations before we arrived. That clearly hasn't happened. We need to unfuck the situation immediately or the entire invasion fails. Sergeant First Class David Williams, a black NCO who'd been a dock supervisor in civilian life before the Army decided he was only qualified for manual labor, studied the chaos. "Sir, we need to establish cargo priorities, create routing systems, and implement inventory tracking. Right now, it's just random unloading. We need organization." Morrison nodded. "Make it happen." What happened next would become a template for every beach operation for the rest of the war. Williams and his fellow black NCOs, men the Army had classified as too simple for complex tasks, designed and implemented a comprehensive logistics system in under 48 hours. They established cargo zones, ammunition in one area, fuel in another, rations in a third, vehicles in a fourth. Each zone was color-coded with painted markers that could be seen from incoming landing craft. They created a traffic control system that routed trucks through the beach without bottlenecks. They implemented a documentation system that tracked every crate, barrel, and vehicle from ship to destination. They organized work parties with specific responsibilities: crane operators, cargo handlers, truck drivers, inventory clerks. Each man knew his role, each role integrated seamlessly with others. And they did all of this while under intermittent German artillery fire and with equipment that was half broken from the invasion. Within 72 hours of the 320th Port Battalion taking over Utah Beach operations, unloading rates had tripled. By D+10, Utah Beach alone was moving 15,000 tons per day, exceeding the planned rate for all 5 beaches combined. General Omar Bradley, commanding 1st Army, visited Utah Beach on June 18th to investigate reports that seemed too good to be true. He watched the operation in silence for 30 minutes. "Who organized this?" Bradley asked Morrison. "My NCOs, sir, primarily Sergeant Williams and his team." Bradley studied the black soldiers working with mechanical precision. "Your NCOs? The colored men?" "Yes, sir. They designed the entire system." Bradley was quiet for a long moment. Then, "How are you achieving these unloading rates?" "Efficiency, sir. My men understand logistics at a level that—" Morrison paused, choosing words carefully. "They're very good at what they do."
What Morrison couldn't say directly, what would have ended his career if he'd articulated it clearly, His black soldiers were better at logistics than the white soldiers who'd been assigned to the same roles. Bradley understood what Morrison wasn't saying. Your unit is operating at twice the efficiency of comparable port companies. I'm assigning you additional beaches. We need this level of performance across the entire sector. Within 2 weeks, Black Port Battalions were operating 4 of the 5 Normandy beaches. Not because the Army had suddenly decided to trust them with important work, because they were the only units that could handle the workload. By July 1944, Black Port Battalions were unloading 40% of all cargo coming ashore in France. 40%. With units that represented less than 15% of total logistics personnel. The mathematics were undeniable. Black units were performing at rates that white units couldn't match. German intelligence noticed. Oberst Heinrich Müller, watching from his observation post, had been tracking American logistics operations since D+1. His initial assessment had been that American unloading rates would decline as the invasion progressed, that the initial planning would give way to the inevitable confusion of extended operations. Instead, the rates accelerated. By August, Müller was filing reports to OKW, German High Command, that described American logistics in almost awestruck terms. American Negro port units are achieving unloading rates that exceed our calculations by 80%. Either our intelligence regarding their capabilities is completely wrong, or the Americans have developed logistics procedures unknown to German forces. A responding memo from OKW expressed skepticism. Confirm these numbers. American Negro troops are classified as inferior laborers. Reported performance levels would require professional training and organizational ability inconsistent with American racial assessments. Müller confirmed the numbers. Then he began investigating how Black Port Battalions achieved such results. What he discovered would be documented in a comprehensive intelligence report captured after the war. A report that provided more honest analysis of black soldiers' capabilities than anything the American Army produced. German military intelligence operated without America's racial prejudices, not because Germans were more enlightened, but because they evaluated enemy capabilities based on observed performance rather than ideology. When Oberst Heinrich Müller filed his initial report on Black Port Battalions in August 1944, he approached it as a tactical analysis. What were these units doing differently that enabled superior performance? He interrogated captured American soldiers. He analyzed intercepted communications. He observed operations from hidden positions. He reviewed captured documents and supply manifests. His findings, compiled in a 47-page report dated September 15, 1944, provided a devastating assessment of American racial policy through the lens of military effectiveness. The report's key findings: on organization, American Negro Port Battalions demonstrate organizational sophistication exceeding white American logistics units. Division of labor is efficient. Communication systems are streamlined. Waste is minimal. These units operate with industrial precision that suggests extensive professional training, yet captured documents indicate most personnel received standard basic training only. On leadership,
Despite official policy requiring white officer command, practical leadership appears to rest with Negro NCOs who demonstrate tactical and organizational abilities inconsistent with American racial classifications. White officers frequently defer to Negro senior enlisted for operational decisions. This creates an effective command structure which American doctrine claims should not exist. On capability, American assertions that Negro soldiers require constant supervision are contradicted by observed operations. These units operate with minimal officer presence. They work unsupervised for extended periods. They make independent decisions regarding cargo handling, equipment usage, and procedural modifications. Performance does not degrade when white supervision is absent. In fact, some observations suggest performance improves. On efficiency, Negro port battalions achieve cargo handling rates 60 to 80% higher than white American units performing identical tasks. Damage rates are lower. Organization is superior. Safety records are better. Every measured performance metric favors Negro units. The report's conclusion was stated with clinical directness. American Negro port battalions represent the most effective logistics operation encountered by German forces in any theater. Their performance suggests either Americans' racial assessments are completely inaccurate or Americans are deliberately suppressing capabilities of their most effective personnel. Either conclusion indicates critical American military vulnerability.
Mueller's report was circulated to senior German intelligence officers. The response was a mixture of fascination and cynicism. One analyst noted in the margins, "The Americans are fighting with one hand tied behind their backs. They have developed superior logistics capabilities and then restricted those capabilities to what they consider inferior troops. If they fully utilized these soldiers' abilities, their supply advantage would be overwhelming." Another analyst focused on exploitation possibilities. American racial tensions create vulnerability. Negro troops treated as inferiors, despite superior performance, will have reduced morale. Potential for psychological operations targeting racial resentment. But the Germans never effectively exploited this vulnerability, because by the time they understood what they were facing, the war was already lost. The Black Port battalions weren't just unloading cargo efficiently, they were enabling the entire Allied advance across Europe. By September 1944, American forces had liberated France and were approaching German borders. This advance required moving supplies over distances that stretched logistics to breaking point. The port of Cherbourg, captured in late June, needed to handle 20,000 tons per day to support advancing armies. The 320th and 6 other Black Port battalions took over Cherbourg operations in July. By August, Cherbourg was moving 28,000 tons per day, 40% over planned capacity. The port of Marseille in southern France was captured in August 1944. Port capacity was estimated at 15,000 tons per day. Black Port battalions took over operations in September. By October, Marseille was moving 25,000 tons per day. Antwerp, Belgium, the critical port that would supply the final push into Germany, was captured in September 1944, but couldn't be used until the Scheldt estuary was cleared in November. American and British logistics experts estimated Antwerp would need 3 months to reach operational capacity once cleared.
Black Port Battalions had it operational at 30,000 tons per day within 6 weeks. Every major port operation in the European theatre was run primarily by Black Port Battalions, and every one exceeded planned capacity by 30 to 80%. The German intelligence assessment of November 1944 stated, "We cannot interdict American logistics. Their port operations are too efficient. Their capacity exceeds our ability to disrupt through bombing or sabotage. The Negro port battalions have made the American supply chain functionally immune to operational disruption." This was the reality German intelligence understood. Black soldiers were performing miracles. But in the American Army, a different narrative was being written. Captain Morrison's after-action report detailed the 320th Port Battalion's exceptional performance. He documented their procedures, their innovations, their achievement of unloading rates that exceeded every standard. His reports were filed and promptly ignored. When senior logistics officers visited ports operated by black battalions, they attributed success to adequate supervision by white officers, or simple tasks performed at high volume. They never acknowledged that the black soldiers might actually be skilled logistics professionals. Private Robert Madison, working 16-hour days unloading ships at Marseille, wrote in a letter to his sister, "We break every record they set. We do the impossible every day. We keep the entire army supplied. And they still call us laborers, still treat us like we're too dumb to do anything except lift boxes. The white officers know better. They see what we're doing. But they won't say it out loud, because saying black men are good at this means admitting everything else they believe is wrong." Madison's insight captured the central contradiction. American officers could see black soldiers performing extraordinary logistics work. But acknowledging that performance meant challenging the racial hierarchy that defined their entire society. So they didn't acknowledge it. They took the performance, classified it as manual labor, and moved on. Meanwhile, German intelligence was documenting what American command refused to admit, that the port battalions weren't just good at their jobs, they were performing at levels that made the entire Allied victory possible. The most visible and most deliberately misremembered example of black logistics excellence was the Red Ball Express. In August 1944, Allied forces broke out of Normandy and began racing across France toward Germany. General Patton's Third Army was advancing 50 miles per day, vastly outpacing logistics plans.
The problem was simple. Armies require enormous amounts of supplies. Fuel, ammunition, rations, replacement parts, medical supplies. Patton's tanks were consuming 400,000 gallons of fuel per day. His artillery was firing tens of thousands of shells. His 250,000 men needed to eat. Normal supply chains moved cargo by rail to forward depots, then by truck to units. But French railways had been destroyed by bombing. There were no forward depots because the advance was too fast. Everything had to move by truck, and trucks had to make round trips of 400+ miles. The Red Ball Express was born on August 25, 1944. A dedicated trucking operation that would run continuously, moving supplies from Normandy beaches to forward units. The name came from railroad terminology. Red Ball meant priority freight that got right of way over everything else.
The operation required 6,000 trucks, 23,000 drivers and support personnel, running 24 hours a day on designated highways marked with Red Ball insignias. 75% of the Red Ball Express drivers were black soldiers from quartermaster truck companies. This wasn't because the Army suddenly trusted black soldiers with critical missions. This was because white soldiers were needed for combat roles, and someone had to drive the trucks. What happened over the next 83 days would create the largest logistics operation in military history to that point, and one that American popular culture would later whitewash almost completely. Staff Sergeant Samuel Davis commanded a convoy of 40 trucks from the 3558th Quartermaster Truck Company. His mission: transport ammunition from Saint-Lô to Patton's forward units near Verdun. 350 miles, round trip 700 miles, through territory where German units were still operating. Davis's company completed this run every 48 hours for 83 consecutive days. The mathematics were staggering. Each truck carried 5 tons of cargo. A 40-truck convoy moved 200 tons. Making the run 41 times meant Davis's single company moved 8,200 tons of ammunition over 28,700 miles of driving. And the 3558th was just one of 137 truck companies operating in the Red Ball Express. The total tonnage moved 412,193 tons of supplies over 83 days, an average of 5,000 tons per day, with peaks exceeding 12,000 tons during critical operations. These weren't short hauls on safe roads. These were marathon drives through war zones, often under German artillery fire, on roads damaged by combat, with minimal rest. The accident rate should have been catastrophic. Exhausted drivers operating worn-out trucks on terrible roads for 16-hour shifts should have produced massive casualties and vehicle losses. Instead, the Red Ball Express maintained a safety and efficiency record that exceeded peacetime commercial trucking operations. How? The answer was the same as with the port battalions. The black soldiers running the operation weren't just following orders. They were innovating, organizing, problem-solving. Sergeant Davis and his fellow black NCOs developed maintenance procedures that kept trucks running far beyond their expected service life. They created routing systems that minimized travel time while avoiding German strongpoints. They implemented convoy protocols that protected drivers from attack while maintaining speed. They built an organizational system that turned thousands of individual truck runs into a coordinated logistics machine. But the most remarkable aspect of the Red Ball Express wasn't the tonnage or the distances. It was the leadership structure. Army doctrine insisted that black soldiers required constant white supervision, but the Red Ball Express operated with minimal white officer involvement. Black NCOs planned routes, organized convoys, coordinated maintenance, managed schedules, and made operational decisions with minimal oversight. Because there weren't enough white officers to supervise 23,000 men operating across 400 miles of French territory, the Army had no choice but to let black NCOs lead, and they led exceptionally well. Technical Sergeant William Thompson organized convoy scheduling for the entire Red Ball system, coordinating hundreds of trucks, managing maintenance rotations, ensuring supplies reached destinations on time. He was doing the work of a logistics staff officer. The Army paid him as a truck driver. Staff Sergeant Marcus Jones developed the route marking system that allowed convoys to navigate at night without lights, critical for avoiding German attention. His innovation saved countless lives and kept supplies flowing. Corporal James Washington, a mechanic who'd been told he wasn't smart enough for technical training, diagnosed and repaired vehicle breakdowns with tools and parts that shouldn't have made repairs possible. He kept trucks running through improvisation and ingenuity that Army maintenance manuals said was impossible for enlisted men without extensive training.
These were men the Army classified as suitable only for manual labor, men who were supposedly incapable of complex thinking or independent judgment. They were running the largest trucking operation in military history with efficiency that commercial companies couldn't match decades later. German intelligence continued documenting the Red Ball Express with amazement bordering on disbelief. An intercepted intelligence report from September 1944 stated, "American Negro transport units are maintaining supply deliveries that enable enemy advances our interdiction efforts should prevent. Their convoy organization and route selection suggest professional planning. Their maintenance procedures keep vehicles operational beyond expected service life. We cannot explain this capability in terms of American racial classifications." The German assessment concluded, either American Negro troops are far more capable than American doctrine suggests, or they have received extensive training that contradicts American policies regarding colored soldiers. The former seems more likely. Recommend revising assessments of American Negro military capabilities. German forces attempted to disrupt the Red Ball Express through artillery bombardment of key routes, fighter attacks on convoys, and guerrilla raids by bypassed German units. None of it worked. The Red Ball Express kept running. When Germans bombed a bridge, black engineers rebuilt it overnight. When convoys were attacked, drivers returned fire and continued their runs. When vehicles broke down, mechanics cannibalized parts and got them running again. The operation achieved 90% delivery success rate, meaning 90% of scheduled deliveries reached their destinations on time, despite every obstacle. For context, modern commercial logistics companies consider 85% on-time delivery to be excellent performance under ideal conditions. The Red Ball Express achieved 90% while driving through a war zone, in worn-out trucks, on bombed roads, under enemy fire. The operation ran from August 25 to November 16, 1944, 83 days. It ended not because it failed, but because Allied forces had advanced far enough that ports closer to the front could take over supply operations. Those closer ports were of course operated by Black Port Battalions. When the Red Ball Express was shut down, Patton's Chief of Staff wrote a commendation. The Red Ball Express achieved the impossible. Without this operation, the Third Army's advance would have stalled in August. These soldiers kept us moving when every military calculation said we should have stopped. The commendation didn't mention race, didn't acknowledge that 75% of the drivers were black, didn't recognize the leadership of black NCOs who'd organized the entire system. It praised the truck drivers generically, as if they were interchangeable parts in a machine, rather than skilled professionals performing extraordinary work. And in the decades after the war, when Hollywood made movies about the Red Ball Express, they cast white actors in the lead roles and implied that white officers had organized and run the operation. The truth that black soldiers had built and operated the most effective logistics system in military history was too threatening to acknowledge. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe.
The war was over. Germany had surrendered. Allied forces had triumphed. The victory had been made possible by the greatest logistics operation in human history. 7 million tons of supplies moved through European ports. 89 million tons transported from America to Europe. 3 million vehicles deployed. 18,000 aircraft delivered. 40% of that cargo, nearly 3 million tons, had been moved by Black Port Battalions. The Red Bull Express and similar operations had transported over 800,000 tons of supplies during critical periods. Black logistics units had made the Allied victory possible in the most literal sense. Without their work, the armies couldn't have fought. The response from the American military was not gratitude. It was erased. Captain Morrison, commanding the 320th Port Battalion, submitted a comprehensive report detailing his unit's achievements, recommendations for commendations, documentation of innovations, statistics proving performance that exceeded every comparable unit. The report was filed and ignored. 0 commendations were awarded. No recognition was given. When the Army compiled its official logistics histories, Black Port Battalions were mentioned in passing as labor units providing essential manual support. Their innovations were credited to effective supervision by logistics officers, meaning white officers who, in many cases, had simply let black NCOs run operations.
The extraordinary performance was systematically minimized and attributed to anything except the capabilities of the black soldiers who'd achieved it. Private Robert Madison returned home to Philadelphia in late 1945. He'd spent 3 years moving cargo across Europe, developing logistics procedures that would influence commercial shipping for decades, working 16-hour days to keep armies supplied. He applied for logistics jobs at Philadelphia's port facilities. He was told they didn't hire colored workers for anything except manual labor. His 3 years of Army logistics experience was dismissed as loading ships, unskilled work that required no training or capability. Madison would work as a janitor until retirement. The skills he'd developed, the experience he'd gained, meant nothing in civilian America. His story repeated across thousands of black veterans, men who'd run ports, organized massive trucking operations, developed innovative procedures, led complex organizations, all reduced to laborers who could only lift and carry. The German intelligence reports that documented black logistics performance were captured after the war. They were filed in archives and classified. When researchers finally gained access in the 1990s, they discovered something remarkable. German military intelligence had provided a more honest and accurate assessment of black soldiers' capabilities than the American military that commanded them. Oberst Heinrich Müller survived the war. He was interrogated by American intelligence officers about German logistics assessments. When asked about the miracle workers terminology in his reports, Müller was blunt. "We called them miracle workers because they performed tasks we calculated were impossible with their resources. Either they were far more capable than Americans believed, or they had developed methods unknown to us. Given that their methods were observable and could be copied, the first explanation seemed more likely. I told your intelligence officers this: you have been fighting the war with artificial handicaps. Your Negro soldiers are your most effective logistics personnel. By restricting them to manual roles and refusing to acknowledge their capabilities, you weaken your own military." This seemed obvious to us.
It was apparently not obvious to you. The American intelligence officer conducting the interrogation filed a report summarizing Mueller's statements. The report was classified and buried. Acknowledging that German intelligence understood something American command refused to see was too embarrassing. For 50 years, the story of the Port Battalions was hidden in classified archives, forgotten in official histories, erased from public memory. Then, in 1992, a historian named Stephen Ambrose researched logistics operations for a book on D-Day. He requested access to classified Port Battalion records. What he discovered shocked him. The unloading rates, the tonnage, the efficiency ratings, the German intelligence assessments, the systematic erasure of black soldiers' contributions from official histories. Ambrose published his findings, arguing that Black Port Battalions deserved recognition as some of the most effective military units in American history. The response from military historians was skepticism. The performance numbers seemed too good. The German reports must be exaggerated. Surely the official histories were accurate. But then other researchers started digging. Compared Port Battalion records to White Unit records, reviewed German intelligence archives, interviewed surviving veterans. Every source confirmed what German intelligence had documented in 1944. Black Port Battalions had performed logistics miracles. They'd operated at efficiency levels White units couldn't match. They'd made the Allied victory possible. And American command had hidden this achievement for half a century because acknowledging it meant admitting that black soldiers were as capable or more capable than white soldiers. In 2019, the Army finally issued a formal statement acknowledging the contributions of Black Port Battalions and logistics units. The statement praised their essential support to Allied operations and recognized that their work had been systematically undervalued in official histories. It was 75 years late. Most of the men who'd performed these miracles were dead. Private Robert Madison died in 1998 at age 78, having worked as a janitor for 30 years after running logistics operations that supplied armies. He never received recognition for his service. Captain Morrison, the white officer who'd commanded the 320th and documented their achievements, spent decades trying to get his men recognized. He wrote letters, he contacted historians, he testified before congressional committees. In 2001, at age 89, Morrison finally saw some vindication when the Army's official logistics history was revised to accurately describe Black Port Battalion's contributions. Morrison died 2 weeks later.
The systematic erasure of black logistics excellence from military history wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate policy designed to prevent exactly what German intelligence had feared: recognition that black soldiers were performing at levels that challenged racial hierarchy. By hiding their achievements, by attributing their success to white supervision, by reducing skilled professional work to manual labor, the Army preserved the fiction that black Americans were suited only for inferior roles. It took 75 years for that fiction to crack. And it only cracked because the documentary evidence was so overwhelming that denial became impossible. Today, if you visit the logistics museums at Fort Lee, Virginia, you'll find exhibits on World War II supply operations. They'll show you charts of tonnage moves. They'll display photographs of cargo operations.
They'll explain how Allied logistics enabled victory. What they won't tell you, what took decades to acknowledge, is that 40% of those supplies were moved by black soldiers the Army insisted were too inferior for skilled work. The German intelligence reports sit in archives now, available to researchers. They make for fascinating reading. Page after page of clinical analysis, documenting performance levels that contradicted American racial doctrine. Oberst Mueller's September 1944 report includes a section titled Tactical Implications of American Racial Policy. The analysis is devastating. The Americans possess superior logistics capabilities, but deliberately limit their utilization by restricting their most effective personnel to subordinate roles. This is militarily inefficient, but politically necessary for them. German forces cannot exploit this weakness because American Negro logistics performance exceeds that of white American units, meaning their weakness is actually a strength they refuse to fully utilize. If Americans recognized and promoted Negro logistics personnel by merit, their supply advantage would become overwhelming. That they refuse to do this suggests domestic political considerations override military efficiency. This may be Germany's only logistics advantage. Americans handicap themselves. Mueller concluded with an observation that would prove prophetic. This contradiction cannot be sustained indefinitely. Either American military policy will adapt to recognize Negro capabilities, or the contradiction will create domestic crisis. The evidence of Negro performance in this war is too substantial to be ignored once peace allows reflection. He was right. It just took longer than he imagined. The Port Battalion's legacy extends beyond World War II. The procedures they developed, the cargo handling techniques, the inventory systems, the organizational structures became standard in commercial shipping. When containerized shipping revolutionized global logistics in the 1960s, many of the principles came from innovations Black Port Battalions had developed in the 1940s. The men who developed those innovations received no credit, no patents, no recognition. Their work was classified as Army procedures and became public domain. Former Port Battalion soldiers watched shipping companies implement systems they had created. Earning billions of dollars from efficiency improvements black soldiers had pioneered while being paid private wages. In 2004, the Port of Oakland dedicated a memorial to World War II port battalions. The ceremony included 3 surviving veterans, all in their 80s. Samuel Davis, former staff sergeant of the 3558th Quartermaster Truck Company, spoke briefly. "We knew what we were doing. We knew we were good at it. We knew we were making history. What we didn't know was that history would try to erase us. But the records exist. The numbers don't lie. We moved 40% of everything that won the war. We did it better, faster, and more efficiently than anyone else. German intelligence understood that. It took America 60 years to admit it. I'm glad we're finally being recognized, but I'm sorry most of my brothers didn't live to see it. They died believing their contribution didn't matter, that they'd just been laborers doing simple work. I want people to know we were professionals, we were the best, and we made the impossible happen every single day." The final irony is that German intelligence reports provide the most accurate historical record of black logistics performance in World War II. The enemy documented what America tried to hide. When researchers compare German assessments to American after-action reports, a pattern emerges. German reports accurately describe black unit performance. American reports minimize, dismiss, or attribute that performance to white supervision. The Germans, with no political stake in American racial politics, documented reality. America, trapped in segregation ideology, documented fiction. Today, modern military logistics relies heavily on lessons learned in World War II, many of them developed by Black Port Battalions and logistics units whose contributions were erased from official records. The efficiency standards commercial shipping uses trace directly to innovations black soldiers developed in World War II. The cargo handling procedures taught in logistics schools worldwide evolved from systems Black Port Battalions created. The miracle workers changed how the world moves cargo. They just never got credit for it.
In 2019, when the Army finally acknowledged Black Port Battalion's contributions, one detail stood out in the official statement. These units consistently exceeded performance standards by margins of 60 to 80%, demonstrating logistics excellence that influenced military and commercial operations for generations. 60 to 80% better than standard, not 5%, not 10%, not about the same with good supervision. 60 to 80% better. That's not a small difference. That's a revolution in capability. That's proof that everything the Army believed about these soldiers was catastrophically wrong. The German intelligence officer who analyzed these numbers in 1944 understood immediately what they meant. The American command took 75 years to admit it publicly. But the evidence remains. In archives, in German intelligence reports, in port records, in shipping manifests, in the cargo that sustained Allied victory. 40% of everything that won World War II in Europe passed through black hands. They moved it faster, more safely, and more efficiently than anyone thought possible. The Germans called them Die Wundertäter, the miracle workers. The American command called them laborers. History eventually called them what they were: the most effective logistics professionals of their generation, whose excellence was deliberately erased because it threatened the racial hierarchy that defined their nation. The ports they operated are still functioning today. The procedures they developed are still in use. The victory they enabled is still celebrated. It just took 75 years for anyone to acknowledge who actually did the work. 3 million tons of cargo, 40% of Allied supplies, 83 consecutive days of the Red Bull Express, 28,000 tons per day through ports designed for 15,000. Not because they were supervised well, not because the tasks were simple, but because they were professionals who'd been told their entire lives they were incapable of professional work, and they proved that lie wrong with undeniable performance. Staff Sergeant Samuel Davis said it best in that 2004 memorial ceremony. "We were the best. We knew it. The Germans knew it. America just took longer to figure it out." The miracle workers performed miracles. The evidence is undeniable. And the enemy understood it first.